Um, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be today in the world. My name is Safiya. I am the co-director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, and I at the University of California, Los Angeles. And I am also a member of the World Economic Forum Council, Global Future Council on AI for Humanity. I'm joined here today by an amazing group of scholars and activists and policymakers, people who are deeply committed to thinking about the future of AI and sustainability. And maybe I might even put that in opposite order, who are primarily concerned about the future of sustainability and the way in which AI also will affect the world. We're especially oriented or thinking today about regulation and the kinds of policies, public policies that we need to enact, but also the types of values that will drive the kinds of regulation that we see in the future. And of course, this is a really important subject and close to the heart, I know, of many people who are watching and participating today in the conference. I want to just take a moment and say that how this day will go is we will, I'm going to ask each of our participants in this session to take about 5 minutes each or so to introduce yourself and the way that you came to this work, kind of what the most pressing issues are for you in the context of how you came to this work and who you are, because I think it's always so much better for us to kind of get to self-define who we are and what motivates us in these conversations. I could read your brilliant bios, each of you, but that would eat up so much time. And what we all want to know is what you're thinking about in terms of the future of sustainability and AI, and of course the kind of regulatory policies that we need. And so think of this as each of you taking your 5 minutes or so as your kind of opening remarks to help frame the conversation that we're going to have today. And we'll each take I'll offer that just by way of my opportunity to meet with each of you. I have had such a pleasure of working with Sara Stratton, also as part of the World Economic Forum. And of course, many of our colleagues are here joined today and are also participating in the live stream. I want to invite all of you who are watching to please feel free to send us your comments or your questions or your provocations, things that you want to hear about as this conversation unfolds this morning. The other kind of primary logic or way that we're going to think through this conversation today is really around the intergenerational ways that we should be thinking about sustainability and AI. And so we've been, of course, incredibly, and Sara, I'm going to invite you to kick us off, but I will say that we have been incredibly heartened, moved, inspired by the work that we see, for example, in New Zealand, where people are thinking about the long-term intergenerational impact of AI on many futures, not just the lived future that each of us is in today. And of course, that kind of orientation to multi-generational concerns, that orientation to the rights of not just human beings with relationship to AI, but also the Earth and all of its inhabitants, is a really, I think, beautiful and powerful provocation and lens by which we might think about the future of AI and sustainability. So we've got with us today Sara Stratton, Larissa, Bolte, Lorena, Jaume-Palasí, and I'm sorry, you know that I've ruined. I'm Safiya Umoja Noble, and I promise you, everyone ruins that in their pronunciation. So Lorena, please get me right. And Gui Hasselbalch. And so I'm just really thrilled to invite you all here into this conversation. And Sara, I'm going to turn it to you to lead us off with your kind of introduction and provocation for about 5 minutes. Thank you.
All right. Kia ora tātou, ka nui te mihi ki a koutou. A small welcome from Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's always difficult to have 1,000 million things to say in a very short time. So I am here specifically in this topic. I started off a life in law 1,000 years ago, learned really how the law colonized us as Māori in Aotearoa, New Zealand and throughout the world. And that ignited a deep passion, if you like, to understand how that happened and why and what can be done. And here I am a couple of decades later. And I just did a master's a couple of years ago on a Māori lens on digital technology, where AI and AI bias became the sharp focus. And as I was studying and reading and interviewing, I thought, hang on, this all sounds very familiar. AI bias, what is it? How does it start? And I thought, oh, hang on a minute. We already know this as Māori in the analog world, through colonization, through institutional sexism, racism, institutional bias. And I thought, oh, this is really simple, but quite terrifying. This is harm done in the analog, or anything done in the analog will be amplified in the digital. And I could feel afraid of that, but I'm heartened, as Safiya said, and it's just such an honour to be on this panel with these women amongst us all, and the work at the World Economic Forum, that internationally these are questions that are being asked in different ways. In this conversation about intergenerational, a few people said, I don't really get intergenerational. For Māori, that is it is our foundational view, because the number one value is relationships with Māori. People, planet, purpose, and people, you could say about purpose that is a spiritual element, the unseen element, or it is the purpose element. And so I think, we live every day inheriting laws, regulations, policies, values, decisions made at another time. We've inherited that. If you look at our environment, we're seeing the impact of those past decisions today. And it is our future, our children and our grandchildren and beyond. They are demanding that we, the holders of decision-making, be responsible for them. We're hearing that cry through great activists, young activists already. So we live this intergenerational circle or linear line, however you want to call it, continuum. It's normative. It's normative for Māori, not exceptional to see this. So whether it's AI, whether it's justice, whether it's education, how we've been brought up to believe is that I have one right, and that is the right to belong. That's where my people in my place, what my people in my place have given me. But my immediate right of belonging sets up an immediate responsibility that whatever it is that I do in this part of the relay race, if you like to look at it like that, is going to add, and I'm going to pass over an inclusive, collectively flourishing future. That's my responsibility. That's what every decision I make is to be based on. Of course, it's an ideal that I strive toward. It's about progress and not perfection. But so in a nutshell, I think I've summed up our culture's, 1,000-year beliefs and points of view, because today, this very moment in this panel, we can discuss that on this powerful tool of artificial intelligence. And so that's the lens I'm bringing. I'm bringing this Māori lens of I'm responsible, I've been given something, some things aren't working, I need to do what I need to do to change so that whatever I pass on is going to be cause an inclusive, flourishing future for our children and grandchildren and beyond. And AI, the power of it means that we are even more responsible to treat this very cautiously. And I know people are, and globally we are. In New Zealand, we've been working with the World Economic Forum on regulation. How do we? That is the $1 million question. And the other $1 million question is, how do we harness the power of AI for good? Again, I sort of think, oh, Māori have a broad, idealistic answer for it. And I just heard in the very end of the last panel, it was about a global agreement, not of assimilation where we all have to be the same to agree on something, but that all of us in our diverse backgrounds and skill base and thought capacity can at least agree that the most important thing, which is the topic of this whole conference, sustainability, which is for Māori, it should be for the human race, that's survival, and more than that, a flourishing future. That we should, if we can keep that as a vision, and then how we get there can be worked out in our diversity, should be considered. So I think that's me in my 5 minutes. But yeah, I can't wait to hear everybody else, and big responsibility starting. But thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Sara. That's really so important. I wrote down, you said we've inherited past decisions that we're living now. And I think nothing could be more powerful. I mean, for us, certainly here in the United States, many of us live under oppressive systems that have been intact since the founding of the country, since the kind of, colonization of the Americas, and the struggle to enact civil and human rights and to respect sovereign rights has been ongoing for hundreds of years. And we see now the kind of implementation or the use of AI and opaque decision-making systems that concretize those relationships, those kinds of oppressive relationships. And I know that this is one of the things that is at the heart and kind of motivating these kind of loss of rights, loss of agency, loss of power, consolidation of power, consolidation of structural racism, sexism, class power. So I just want to, invoke that also, Sara, because your comments really remind us that we are born into these systems, but it is kind of our responsibility to take on what do we do to change those systems, right? And to take responsibility for enacting more equitable futures, and so that the laws and policies that we are born under do not overdetermine our future. And so these are the kinds of things that in negative ways, obviously. So these are some things that I think are themes we want to keep in mind. And I want to remind people who are watching that regulation is one of these words that I think can often obfuscate the heart of the matter, which is often about the protection of vulnerable people, the ability to surface and grant rights to people. You could think of civil rights and human rights and sovereign rights laws as regulations in society also. So just a reminder, Sara, I think you've really set us up powerfully for thinking about what is it? What are the values at stake when we're talking about regulation? Well, what we're talking about are the values that are at stake for the kind of societies that we want to live in, the kind of world we want to live in and pass on. So, Larissa, I want to bring you into the conversation and invite you to kind of share with us your work and how you come to this conversation and what you think are the most important kind of provocations we should be thinking about today.
Sure, thank you for having me. Let me just briefly introduce myself. So my name is Larissa Bolte. I am a master's student of philosophy at the University of Bonn. I'm also a research student at the Institute for Science and Ethics. And I actually came to this entire space because I'm one of the organizers of the Sustainable AI conference where we're speaking right now. And I'm here in my capacity as a member of the younger generation because I was researching all these topics in preparation for the conference, and I really noticed how much there is to learn and how these two things that I've grown up with relate. Like I've been growing up with climate change and this entire catastrophe looming over my head, and all the while I felt really powerless. And at the same time, I was growing up with new technologies, the internet, smartphones, all that came up when I was young. So it's really weird to me that I never thought these two together, or never really thoroughly thought these two together. And I'm really happy that I have all these notable experts on this panel at my disposal to just address my worries and my talking points that I had. And this is also what I'd like to introduce, maybe to get the conversation going. So I would just like to name two worries and then three talking points. So one is a rather general worry that I have, and I believe it concerns everyone, and that is the problem that I see that there's this really big push internationally to get AI going in order to stay competitive. Countries want to be the next place where AI is happening. They want to stay on the forefront. But at the same time, I think this conference has shown that there's so many unknown long-term impacts, especially from the widespread use of AI. Maybe not single AI models, but the push to have more and more and more AI. And I feel like these two factors combined are really, really dangerous. And I'm actually very worried about that, especially in combination with the short-sightedness of some political decisions that have been made. I'd like to address the newest EU regulation. And that all combines to a perfect storm, I believe, and I hope we can discuss. If I may, I would also like to share a more personal worry, and that is that I always had trouble to live an authentic and ethical life in face of the climate crisis. I worry about my consumer decisions. I worry about my lifestyle. I want to see the world, of course. I'm growing up. I'm getting to know through the internet as well all these really interesting places, but I feel bad about going there because I know that's bad for climate, for example. And then the issue that I'm now getting aware of with AI, for example, is that there's so many other decisions. Like I'm using AI every day, basically. I don't even notice when I'm using it, and I have no way of telling whether it's even sustainable. So I'm very happy that we had some discussions, for example, about care labels recently. I think it was yesterday. My talking points that I would like to address are the following, and I think they're pretty related to my worries. So I want to talk about the long-term impact of widespread AI adoption. So what do we even have to worry about? Mostly I focus on the environmental, but I also worry a lot about societal shifts and power relations and how AI affects power between countries, between businesses, between individual people, and also how it affects discourse, for example. Of course, I want to talk about current and future regulations and what can be done, because I started with saying that I'm worried how I can act as a consumer, but actually I don't want to be responsible as a consumer. I want big solutions for big problems, basically, if I may use that slogan. And then finally, one topic that I thought was really interesting, that's maybe not as practical as the other two, but I still think is really relevant, is the topic of meta-narratives, and especially the dichotomy of technological solutionism on the one hand, the idea that if we just make AI better and help it or use it for the common good, then we will get out of the climate crisis, for example. And on the other hand, the narrative of the Anthropocene, the idea that humans are just this really big force of nature now, no one can stop us, the damage is already done, that kind of idea. And I want to especially discuss which one of these, well, of course, it's hard to say which one of these is correct because they're narratives, they're stories. But I also want to talk about who these stories help, who's benefiting from which side of the story, and who's pushing these stories, and how we should behave when we see those stories, or how we should answer to these stories. I don't know how I'm doing on time. I hope I'm okay. I just have one quick appeal to make, and I think it's really simple to say it, but really hard to solve. I think this conference has shown that right now is really the time to set up regulations, institutions, standards, for example. It's happening right now. And once these standards, regulations, institutions are set up, it's very, very hard to change them again. So I just urge everyone who's making decisions right now to keep the interests of the younger generations, but also future generations in mind. And I'm happy to just be a voice right now on this panel to just urge that. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Larissa. That's really, we're going to come back around to these questions, these provocations that you've given us. And I want you thinking about now about what might be lost if we do not think intergenerationally about AI regulation. So I want to turn now to Lorena and invite you to join the conversation, to give me and all of us the proper pronunciation, because, I just feel terribly American this morning. But I want to say thank you for joining us, and we want to hear from you.
It's Lorena Jaume-Palasí. It's fine. Most of us have been there, so very often. I feel baptized every day. So it has something of a celebration. So it's fun. I'm totally fun, and I know you have similar experiences. And as Sara and Larissa so beautiful said, I think there's a lot behind the idea of regulation that needs to be unwrapped. And this is also how I came to this space, and starting by thinking, what is the thinking behind normativity? What is the thinking behind the way how we create laws? And then looking also at how it is connected to other types of thinking. For instance, the way how we create science and the thinking behind creating science, and approaching to mathematics, and we're approaching to the creation of technology, and realizing that there's a lot of commonalities between both the way how we think behind the creation of algorithmic systems on the one side, and how we create regulation as well, at least from the Roman, German legal cultural approach, which is the approach that has been most exported all over the world. It's in all 5 continents. It's colonized all 5 continents as a cultural legal system. And by thinking about how those two really conflate and are very, very, very much the 2 sides of the same coin, I also started to think more also in the context of infrastructure, right? When we think about law, this is from a political scientist approach, this is a form of what we call soft infrastructure. And the same applies very actually to everything that we do with AI. It's computational infrastructure. It's infrastructure of the future. This is how we're going to be automating processes in our societies. And when we create infrastructure, I think that there's a few things and myths that are important in this conversation, and really have a crucial point around the concept of interregional.
I know it's intergenerational, but it's hard. I know, because we're not used to invoking it.
Why? Because when you create infrastructures, it usually takes longer than what you assume. It takes longer to create than when you assume, and it takes longer to delete or to destroy that, what you assume. So let's take, for instance, a very classic example is the IT infrastructure of the German police. It was created in the 1970s, and it runs until now. So this means that every month, a lot of technicians from the diverse German institutions and ministries are traveling by train to a very small town somewhere in the German woods, praying that a specific engine to, oh, sorry, I think I froze. I did froze. Okay, yes. So we have these engineers from the ministries traveling by train to somewhere in the German woods to meet an 80-year-old engineer while praying that this person does not die, because this engineer is the only person that is able to program in the language of the 70s for the running infrastructure. And it took 5 years to pass a law that requires now and allows the government to change the whole IT infrastructure and to get also the budget. And after those 5 years, they are starting now to design the tools and the infrastructure that is needed to create the new infrastructure. And it will take them another 10 years to finish with that, which means that in the very end, the actual technology that they are going to apply is something that they don't know of already because it doesn't exist yet, which is the same thing that happened with the trains. They started creating the trails for the whole countries in a time where trains needed to turn around. They needed a space to turn around to go in the opposite direction and go back to from the origin to the destiny, and from the destiny back to the origins. Now, after they were done with that trail infrastructure, trains didn't need that anymore. They just could go in both directions. So this is one of the most important points of creating infrastructure. It means that this is something that takes a lot of effort, that takes a lot of generations, and that you need to create understanding that what you are creating is going to be implemented in a time that is going to be very much different to the ones that you are parting from. And in these conversations, what strikes me the most is that we talk about creating infrastructures that are efficient, but efficiency is based on the capacity to be able to adapt to a stable situations. And this means with that this is not sustainable, because it's resiliency, the ability to be able to adapt to societal changes, what really makes the creation of infrastructure that makes sense in a more meaningful way. If we create infrastructure that is efficient, then we're creating infrastructure that is going to be good for a stable situation. Now, in 20 years, the situation will not be the same. So that infrastructure that we've been creating will not be of use for the newer generations. If we think of resiliency, this sort of runs as a guiding principle, quite contrary to the idea of efficiency. So this has been one of my worries, and also one of the things that have been pushing me a lot to think about how do we bring all those two things together, creating both resilient creating both resilient infrastructures with new technology, and also understanding and trying to push for unwrapping the thinking behind all those two and how those things are connected. Because in the very end, whatever we do now, it's gonna be placed upon the newer the younger generations, and way longer afterwards. And as someone from the Spanish community, we have more. I was raised by the idea that you're not only you, but you're also part of your community, and that whatever you do, it has an impact on your community. So if you care, then whatever you do is by thinking in relation to that as well. And for me, infrastructure is one of the most high impact tools to produce care.
Lorena, I really appreciate so many of these examples that you've given us, because I think, part of why it's difficult for the public and especially regulators, because we want to remember that regulators, legislators around the world are influenced by publics and by public pressures too. It really requires, I think, scholars and activists and thinkers who are working in this space to narrate and storytell in the way that you've really done here with this example. And so I want us to be thinking about kind of what are the metaphors we should be invoking to make more legible what's at stake, because, what we know is that, I'm often kind of joke about this in a painful way that silicon corridors around the world, places like Silicon Valley and beyond, the Silicon Valleys of the world, spend hundreds of millions of dollars to, go into the woods and imagine a future, while the rest of us grapple with the consequences of those imaginaries, right? That where we're kind of those technologies are beta tested upon us and our communities. And we don't have the same kind of runway of time and resource and space to create the kinds of imaginaries that we would like to see also in this world. Much of our time is spent kind of resisting or trying to negotiate the ways in which we come into contact with different kinds of systems, power systems, and technological systems. And so, Gui, I know that you have spent a lot of time thinking about these issues in the EU and have been working, on the front lines of kind of EU data ethics policy. And so, thinking about just how we, what the imaginaries are that have been invoked in order to even create a regulatory framework, but also how we might, hear about your work and keep in mind more metaphors or narratives that can make these issues legible.
Thank you. So, Safiya, I think I also have a problem with pronunciation of names. So yes, as you said, I have worked with data ethics for many years. I'm the co-founder of a think tank called Data Ethics, and I was a member of the EU high-level group that Amy was also a member of, and we created EU ethics guidance. So I've been really following this regulatory space, and also, as you say, the narratives invested in this. But one thing that another thing that's kind of interesting about my background that I actually don't usually talk that much about is that I spent 10 years working with online youth protection and empowerment. So I actually traveled around to different governance events around the world with youth and brought them into internet governance debates and all these kind of things. And so basically, as Larissa said, I think I also realized at some point that, bigger solutions, as you said, you need bigger solutions for bigger problems. We can't leave this up to the children, for example. We need to have, the industry, and we have regulators to invest in this. At that time, actually, that was in the early 2000s, we had this kind of environment where there was a big Web 2 thrill. Everything that came from Silicon Valley was amazing, and we kind of just incorporated it into our infrastructures, even without even thinking about the consequences. I still remember, walking into some of those rooms with a lot of happy developers and regulators saying, well, there's also an issue of privacy, and say, oh, you're old-fashioned and boring, or a tinfoil hat, which was what we were usually called, no? And so at one point, I actually quit my job. It was a governmental job, actually. It was in the Danish Ministry of Culture. I worked in a big European network on this. And actually, kind of tongue-in-cheek, I tweeted, my job is done. I created a child online protection button, and now all children are safe. But of course, that was a little bit saying, we need different kinds of, we cannot just create a technological solution. We cannot just raise awareness. We actually need to go directly to the businesses. So some of the things I started working which is most of my work focused on now is this kind of the imaginations of a big tech kind of tracking by default business models. How did it evolve? How did it become part of regulation? I published a book on it in 2016 on looking at this movement, almost like also even comparing it to the green movement, where we were seeing that there were companies and businesses that were starting to change their ways, understanding that actually users were upset about losing control. And then, after all of this, and while I've been working on this, I actually also decided to write a PhD at some point. I was very happy to have Safiya in my PhD committee on data ethics and power, and actually looking at these things that Lorena talked about before, about these socio-technical infrastructures that we have and the power dynamics that are invested in them. Now, based on all of this, I have 2 points that I want to make that are kind of inspired by my work with data, AI, power, and youth. Mostly, one thing I have to add here is that I started working also together with Amy and the Bonn Institute on a project that I'll work on the coming year on data pollution and power, actually. And in connection with that, I have 2 points. One is about this intergenerational impact of what we could call data pollution of data-intensive systems like AI. And the second one is about this very reductive temporal qualities of AI that I think we could also kind of call temporal pollution of AI. So if we think about data pollution, for example, that's the first point. Of course, we can think of data pollution as one of the biggest issues of the big data society, as these kind of adverse effects of data exhaust on I think, not only on our natural environment, but also on our social and personal environments. So of course we have, as we've heard a lot during this conference, we have this tremendous carbon footprints of the data exhaust of AI, for example. Then I think another thing that we have also is that we have the digital data footprints. That's something that I've been working with a lot, of the digital technologies that kind of create, we have these digital data footprints that of our pasts that kind of immobilize and shape our futures in very concrete ways. So this has, of course, future democratic effects. It has personal implications and all these other things. And I think particularly on this point, I think one thing we tend to forget in policy and in the public debate is that there is not just this moment, this current community of people that we have to take care of, that we have to protect, but there's actually already an entire data polluted generation. And that's the generation that I used to work with back when I worked with youth empowerment. And this was the one that was growing up during the early 2000s when we had this Web 2 hypes in policy and industry. It was the first generation that was on social media, because actually back then, you might not remember it, but adults really didn't use social media. And they were tracked and they were surveilled and they were profiled totally outside adult supervision and care. And this was just because one adult industry sector actually managed to convince an entire adult population, at least most of it, of policymaker. And trust me, I was part of it, so I know this. And also academics actually, about this thing that privacy is no longer a social norm in the digital sphere. And we can think of this as kind of one lost generation that wasn't protected by these data protection law reforms that we have now, this new privacy by designs, the media literacy education that we're creating, all these alternative business models that don't track data, and that have only emerged over the second half of the 2010s. And actually also they are not emerging everywhere. So I'm not going to take up too much time, because I think we can talk about my second point that I would like to draw in later and bring it up in this discussion. But I just wanted to mention it kind of very quickly. So as I said, we can think about data pollution of our different social and natural and personal spaces. But there's one aspect that we tend to forget that I think is really relevant to this panel, and this is this idea that AI in and by itself, it also pollute our time in very concrete ways. So I'm talking about this kind of AI temporal rationality that limits the responsible actions we take between generations in time. But it also, and I think some of you have also really been pointing at this, it disempowers these experiences and voices of very often always the less powerful communities, like, for example, children, that are usually in these AI systems and these AI infrastructures. They're reduced to this kind of instantaneous data that the systems can use and they can act on. They're basically tripped of their own qualitative times. But I mean, we can talk a little bit more about that. I don't want to take up more time. So thank you.
You've given us so many important provocations here. I can see everybody's like, we have things to say to add to this, but I think, the invocation of a data pollution, it actually isn't even a metaphor. It's an actuality, but it's certainly a really important provocation to help us think about, how we would regulate through those frameworks. And again, I was recently on a panel and I was talking about, if the Exxon Valdez or Chevron or Shell Oil or any major oil company has an oil spill, in the old days, they just had an oil spill. And then we invoked regulations, right, that would require cleanup. But of course, the long-term, long-lasting impact and the damage of that extends far beyond the immediacy of just the cleanup effort. It changes the oceans, and it took a long time for us to create policy that would protect the oceans and understand the interrelationship between what happens in the oceans and what happens for the earth and for its inhabitants and for the humans, but also, pressing back on this idea of how corporations and companies are responsible for creating environments that have such profound impact that we all kind of inherit. So I want to come back around, Sara, to you. A lot has been said since you gave your opening comments, and maybe give everybody a minute or two each just to kind of respond to some of the conversation that's been raised this morning today.
Yes, a great deal. If we're talking regulation, I really loved what Lorena was saying about infrastructure and the law. During this master's, I saw the law as the analog version of algorithms. They're embedded with values. And for Māori, it's never sort of been the what, it's always who has this power to make the decisions. And, I'm going to say something that's probably pretty crass, but when I, doing my research, when you look at the demographic of who was embedding their values into this legal system that we all inherited through, some of us through colonization, others just through a natural inheritance, and you compare it to the demographic of Silicon Valley, and you see that it's a very similar demographic. It's going to be fairly privileged white males. And you just think, how is this so that 500 years, 1,000 years later, the same demographic has so much of the power? And really all we see reflected back to us is their thinking, what's important to them, their ideals. Now, I'm not saying that it's bad, that they're all bad, but it's just a natural thing that if you get a group of one sort of anything, if you had a whole lot of apples all bunched together and apples could make decisions, the apples are going to make decisions that make sense to apples. Bananas might just get totally left behind because they're not even thought of, because there's only one group. So for Māori, we're like, okay. And over that 180 years since our Treaty of Waitangi was signed, so relatively new compared to other countries that are colonized, every generation has handed over the baton to say, get into the legal system, get into the legal system. And that's why when I did law, that's why I was doing law, because it was embedded. You've got to get into the infrastructure to change the infrastructure. But actually, I realized that that's actually not, it was a type of answer. But what's actually needed is, especially in this time of AI, is every person is now required to be able to participate. Now, this is going to sound like a dream, but I'm going to dream huge. Why not? Because we're on a panel. Every person is required to bring their mindset to this, because great change is needed in this power base, whether it's embedding values in the legal system or embedding values in powerful algorithms that become tools that predict over other people's lives. So if I can just keep pushing for, if technology is so amazing, if this AI, which they keep saying is just this tremendously, exponentially fabulous thing, then surely it's got the technical ability. We're all now digitally connected. There are eyes on us. Why is it then not possible for, if I can find my true love on Tinder, surely we can all then be connected in a much more purposeful, proper way to make decisions about maybe the law, maybe policies. Maybe I come home from work and I get an alarm on my phone that says a new policy is up about social justice, about something. Do I want to be involved? I should be allowed an opt-in. I'm a citizen. It should be a citizen-to-citizen legal system that reflects all citizens, not just one demographic over and over every single decade. So I sort of say that. I say we are looking at the who. And data, as Greer was saying, data is it. Without data, algorithms are a floppy tube that do nothing. So Māori look at, we have a sovereignty over our data group that are starting to monitor how it is that we can reclaim our data and take the power back. Data is, as I've read over the years, it's new gold, it's new oil, it's, my data. I should be able to reclaim that. So Māori are saying to our government, because this is where it does start. It starts with the systems we've got and the people we've got. We've got to have allies in those systems that realise things need to change. And Māori is saying, we would like back our data that you have on us so that we can provide solutions for ourselves. So that is in an analog way, and then looking forward to realising that our data is going to be even stored in other countries in these huge powerhouses, and different laws are going to apply, and that this treaty that we're meant to have, Māori and the Crown in New Zealand, will no longer apply. We're sort of saying that is enough now. We're reaching critical mass here, and we need to, as Māori, we need to reclaim. But it's not just Māori, we know that, but we're hoping that if in the New Zealand government and policymakers can understand that, we can wedge that prize, that door wide open, where a certain demographic always has the power, and allow in many more voices. But as Māori, we are quite mobilised in that way. And I'm sure I'm not alone. I only speak for Māori. I can't speak for other Indigenous people. But we sort of, the Industrial Revolution of the late 1700s has changed the world, the Western world anyway, I should say. It just changed everything. And I can see not a hark back to pre-industrialization, but we need to reach a place where efficacy, efficiency, this sort of quick pace, something, if more people were involved in the decision-making processes, we could start to calm down. This idea that AI is a commodity, it's another Western way of looking at AI, we would see it as a tool, and that tool would only be useful if it was going to do what we always make our decisions based on. It was going to provide a flourishing future. It was going to help provide a collective, that the collective has well-being today and onward. If we stop seeing it as a commodity to buy and sell, like the West looks at the land as a commodity, where we look at her as a relation, something to protect and honor, because the truth is we need her more than she needs us. As COVID taught us, when the world stopped and wildlife. So I could go on and on and on. My big thing is I just think that technology has an answer to allow the who to change, to be much more inclusive, much more diverse, and that's an answer to mitigating some of the harm of bias. I don't know if I answered anyone else's question, but I really wanted to say that.
We loved listening to you, so it's completely fine. I want to, Sara, what you've done is really invoke a very powerful, as my friend B. Diaz, who we work with at WEF, says, you've really invoked a powerful freedom dream, a sense of what could be possible. And one of the things that I always try to, openly state when I'm speaking on these matters is that we understand the very sharp criticism, because quite frankly, it has been the people who have been most negatively impacted for the last 20 years solidly, who have primarily been women, people of color, and LGBTQ plus communities of scholars, journalists, activists who have crystallized the most important issues. We would not even be able to have these conversations about regulation or about putting the brakes on or putting up guardrails if it had not been for the incredible harm and damage that the kinds of things you've talked about and that we've all kind of been invoking here in this session. So we know that the analysis is very sharp now after 20 years of witnessing kind of the harms enacted over and over again, the disposable people and communities who, for whom many of these products and technologies are beta tested upon. So what I love about the things you just shared, Sara, is that you've really also invoked a kind of what B would call a freedom dream, a sense of like, well, what now that we know and have diagnosed and actually captured the attention of policymakers around the world that there's a problem and we're going to need to address it. I want to offer now a couple of minutes to Lorena and Gui and Larissa to just what's our way forward? What should we care about? What is the world? What is the imaginary? What are the values? What are the principles? Whatever kind of framework resonates for you that we should be thinking about? Because I think that we need to hear that alongside and in the context of the very sharp analysis that you've given us. Lorena.
So if parting from, like, as Sara beautifully said, this technology is about technology that impacts communities. It's a technology that tries to understand how specific patterns at a collective level work. So if we use something with AI, it's going to be something that gives us a sense of, from a statistical perspective, I did froze again. I'm so sorry. I'm in the middle of a very bad connection somewhere in the woods in Germany. So it's not that good, our infrastructure, as some people would assume. So we use a technology that uses mathematics to understand collective. So the mathematics are not the mathematics that we use to understand particularities to a single atom and cell of an individual. They are quite the contrary. We are using mathematics to strip off individuals from their particularities and create a sense of a generic individual and create a sense of what is it from a mathematical perspective that we see as a pattern in our collective. So it's a technology, let's put it like this metaphor, to understand the woods and not to understand the tree. Now, if we look at law, and this is the major difference between the Roman German legal law culture, the Anglo-Saxon, and the common law culture. Those two law cultures that have the main difference to algorithms is that they don't understand the woods. They are about the tree. Our law methodologies are methodologically individualistic. They are about providing fundamental rights to individuals. The way how you address and redress runs at an individual level. So with that, what you can do is try to get a hold, a regulatory hold of the woods by regulating tree by tree, which doesn't make a lot of sense because the woods are more than the sum of its trees. And now what we have with the situation is that we're seeing the homework that a lot of feminist philosophers, but also STS and the colonial studies have been pointing out at democracies for a long time, which is democratic societies are more than the sum of individual interests. There is homework there that needs to be done regarding public interest and values that go beyond individual values. Because of course it is important, individual rights are important and the individuals need to be protected. Fundamental rights are necessary in a society, but they need also to be balanced with public interests, with societal interests that are more than just individual interests. They are things like sustainability. There are things like security, culture, plurality, social cohesion. Those are values, by the way, that have been spelled by the European Union, but also by the Council of Europe in the 80s and the 90s, when they started to create a new approach to regulate infrastructure. And they understood that for that context, they could not use individual approaches because it wouldn't work. But that work sort of was stalled at the end of the 90s. And it wasn't developed more. And I'm not saying that it's easy to, and that all the values that I mentioned are to be followed, but it was just to put a few values that have a collective level and that need some thinking and some more work to just try to understand what type of societal values do we want in our societies to be balanced with individual rights, so that we have that we have societies that are able to go from to also, so to say, address that other part of our society, to also go back to understand that that our radical individualistic approaches, both to technology and also to normativity, are the things that are making a lot of harm when we create infrastructures. Because infrastructures, the same as the woods, they're not about making commodities for every and each individual, but they are about shaping societies. And when they shape societies, this always means that you cannot make it right to 100% extent. It means that there's people that are gonna, and communities that are gonna have problems of access to those infrastructures, because infrastructure is the most subtle way of deciding how power is distributed in a society. And with that, what we need to think about is both that collective methodological aspect in law that needs to be addressed the values that go with it. And we also need to think on the balance of how to balance it with individual rights and protection of individuals. And we also need to think about how these values that we want in our society and create at that infrastructural level can be enshrined in laws that are not about in the same way, and here comes the similarities with the algorithmic thinking, are about creating categories that in the very end lead to more exclusion. Because, and that's the other aspect that sort of worries me a bit, is that as a general, very, very general, perhaps too raw, drafty rule, what you can say is that if you create systems, if you systematize processes in a way that you are essentialistic, that you're trying to first decide what is a human being in order to decide what those human beings should do. If you think that you can create all the drawers in this world to define the essence of a human being and enshrine those categories both either in law or in technology, you are going to fail. Because human life, humans are very rich, are very ambivalent, and all those nuances cannot be either mathematized or you cannot create enough drawers for that. It's not possible. If then you add to this the an universalistic approach, thinking that with those categories you can rule all over the whole world, it's going to be worse. And if you think that this all might work based on rationality, which is a rationality pretending to be neutral, to be objective, you are for 100% for sure always going to fail to some community, already because there are more than one ways to get to a specific point. And also because in the way how you are categorizing and systematizing, you're putting emphasis in the categories to decide what those categories should do. But if we take a look, for instance, at discrimination, we see that the categories for which people are being discriminated are contingent. They change in time. The bodies and the optics of a body, the way how the standards that we have of beauty have changed across the centuries. What is beautiful now wasn't beautiful in some countries and continents 100 years ago. And we also already in this world have a lot of differences about our understanding of beauty. So for body shaming, there's people that is being discriminated when they are trying to get a job. And those categories will change across centuries and across decades and across continents. And if we always try to focus on protecting categories instead of understanding that discrimination happens as a power asymmetry, that it's not about the nodes, but about the interactions between the nodes. If we don't understand this is about the process, we're always going to have also at the regulatory level the same problems, because we are also categorizing and essentializing and creating a systematization at a normative level that is pretty much the normative side of this technological approach that we have already. So I think that thinking more about the relations that we have to each other, about how those relations can be regulated, understanding that everything is relational and that my part also depends on the part of other communities. I think that those are really important approaches that would lead to different paradigms when regulating, paradigms that sometimes we can learn from, perhaps from other approaches to normativity that are more relational. So in some continents, there is a relational idea of ethics, and there's other continents that have a less anthropocentric approach to laws, but also to the ways how they create things that they. For instance, there's this wonderful example from Australia with the fires last year, where the westernized universities were creating drones and exoskeletons for the fire people so that they would have human superpowers or optimize their human capacities to sort of deal with the fires. And the indigenous community that was in charge of the reservoir, they decided to look at the traditional cultural fire rituals and realized that those cultural fire rituals were a calendar, were extractable to a calendar where they could understand, if they look at the fire as a process where they need to initiate specific artificial fires to avoid bigger fires. So they were programming things not based on optimizing human power or human capacity, so not anthropocentric, but they were looking at the process of how fire started and developed and end, and then deciding where to approach. And it led to 75% less fire in that section than in the rest of the country. So that says a lot already of how where we should be learning from. And to me right now, I think that in Europe and in the European conversations that we have at the European Union level, as a member also from the International Advisory Board on AI from the European Parliament, I think that it's time for us to rather to learn from others than to try to keep exporting values that need a lot of revisitation and that need a lot of rethinking, because we have been doing all this wrong. A lot of what is happening in Silicon Valley is a lot of old European cultural thinking that started already with Descartes and with Leibniz. And we need to stand to those mistakes instead of thinking that they are the best, we in Europe.
Yes. I think there are many people watching who are snapping for you, Lorena. Really captured you. And I mean, this whole conversation, I feel a bit guilty because I haven't invited any questions in from anyone who's watching right now. And of course, if you have them, I know that many of us are, on Twitter and available by email, and some of these conversations might continue in other conferences or forums. I want to really give Larissa, you an opportunity. We've got about 6 more minutes before this panel concludes. So I can't even invite in any other questions because you all are so fascinating and your work and your points of view are so important. I do want to share just for those who are watching, and then we're going to do kind of one last, Larissa. I want to give you an opportunity to respond and flesh out anything that we've missed in this conversation, that if we were kind of, if regulators were listening to this conversation, what else do you think that they should know or be thinking about? Before I do that, before I pass the mic back to you, I want to just say that we're going to be writing up this session, this panel, and turning it into a report that we share through the World Economic Forum Global Council on the Future of AI and Humanity. So we're going to really try to capture these ideas and polish them up into a report that we can share out. So just want to make sure that if there's any other things that we capture in that report, that we take this last 5 or 6 minutes to name that. So Larissa, I'm going to give you just if you'll just give us a top line, takeaway from this session that you want to make sure. And then Guia, try to give you a couple minutes too. And maybe Sara, you'll have the last word, the last 30 seconds. Okay. All right, Larissa.
Thank you. So first of all, I just want to say that I wholeheartedly agree that we really have to push different perspectives and get those perspectives heard. And I think, well, now that this is my last statement, so I want to talk about something that's dear to my heart. So I would like to just throw in that in order to do that, in order to get these perspectives heard, we really need to take back the narrative. And that is a narrative that is really centered around or based in people's ignorance and their really understandable human laziness. And if I may, I might like to maybe give an analogy from the tobacco industry. What they basically did in order to push back regulation and also to keep people smoking was basically to just publish studies that said that there is no clear link between smoking and cancer, so that they had some kind of deniability. And that is also something that might be applicable to the AI space, and especially when they're presenting new technologies as solutions and presenting problems that there might be as something that we will overcome, something that is not yet solved but will be solved. And people don't really look into it that much because they hope it will be solved, because that means they wouldn't really have to change their way of life. They could keep on enjoying what they enjoy. They can keep on using these apps that are so addictive. And to push all of these kind of worries aside and just evoking some kind of hope that there will be some solution in the future. And that's just what I'd like to urge, that we will have to identify these narratives and to counter them. And I think you've all done a really great job doing that today, giving your perspectives and giving your critiques. Yeah, and that's just like, that's my appeal that I would like to end with.
Thank you so much. Gui?
I'll be really quick. So I think that, like, basically from this entire discussion, I think one of the most important things that we can bring out here is this idea about this holistic governance approach. So we have to kind of think of solutions that have an understanding of our histories of the past and the future, and what kind of not only a collective history and past and future, but also one that involves a kind of multiple pasts and multiple futures that are kind of creatively open and are not just something that we predetermine, for example, by law or by technology. And in this context, one thing that I think is really important to think about when we talk about AI, it's again to go back to this idea about the temporal pollution of AI, because I'm thinking the more and more we have AI infused infrastructures and we use them as part of this way of regulating and governing, part of our decision-making powers, we might also have to consider and think about how this, if we really want this holistic approach, if we really want to have this inclusive approach where we have multiple actors and multiple experiencing that are shaping our societies, then AI might not be the best tool in terms of helping us in doing this, because this is, by default, as I said, and I think that's also kind of very much what Lorena was pointing at, it doesn't have the capacity to include these experiences. And so in terms of governance, we should really take care in how we use AI. We should be in charge of it for sure, as humans and multiple cultures, and create creative futures that we're in charge of. And that was this my last point.
Absolutely. I mean, there could be, outside of war and weapons, it's a rather blunt instrument to design the kinds of futures that you're talking about, for sure. We've got 1 minute left, and there were so many. I just had a question come in, and I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to engage it. But Sara, I want to give you the last 30 seconds because your invocation this morning to kick us off really was powerful. So as we close this panel, are there any kind of parting words that you could leave with us?
So I founded Māori Lab, which realizes that we're humans dealing with a tool, not the other way around, I hope. So it seems like a slow and antiquated approach, but it's going to businesses and organizations and helping them. People are so quick to be digitally upskilled, and they're very quick as a competitive edge. But what I'm saying, well, in New Zealand anyway, is if you're in Aotearoa New Zealand, you need to be Māori culturally upskilled along the process. You need to reach higher in your humanity as well as be quick with your digital technology. And I want to just my last statement is from an elder who has passed away a long time. And he said this, he said, Western science and technology may claim to have the know-how, but we have the know-why. Without the know-why, that know-how is going nowhere fast. The know-why keeps us in the core and gives us the vision and is our arrow forward. So I think that's what I'd say. I'd always say, who is involved and why are you doing this? And I suppose that's where I'll end with our elder.
Thank you. That takes us to time. Thanks, everyone. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I can't wait to see you all again. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for this session, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Safiya. Thanks,
everyone.